Congressional changes under President Jefferson. So we've talked only about the purchase of the Louisiana Territory and what went on the exploration of Lewis and Clark. This is the political part of Jefferson's presidency. Now, what party does Jefferson belong to? Political party. Republicans. And who controls Congress? Republicans. So, because he's got a new Congress that's controlled by the Republican Party, he's going to convince them to make several changes in the federal government. I'm going to give you 5 examples of congressional changes under President Jefferson that he was able to accomplish, kids, because he had a Republican Congress. Okay? 5 congressional changes under President Jefferson, and they all should kind of make sense to you. First change, he repealed the excise tax on what? What did we tax that got everybody wound up? Whiskey, very good. So Congress repealed the tax on whiskey. Jefferson from the start regarded that tax as unconstitutional, but at the time was not in a position to make a change. So when he became President of the United States and he had a Republican-controlled Congress, Congress repealed the excise tax on whiskey. So there's no more whiskey tax. Okay, that was one change Jefferson did during his presidency. He also repealed, number 2, Congress. He didn't. He talked Congress into repealing the Judiciary Act of 1801. Now this is going to come to be an interesting story, so we'll kind of keep that in mind. The reason he repealed the Judiciary Act of 1801 was because of those midnight appointments that President Adams had made. Okay, because they were all what type of judges? Federalist. Okay, so the second thing Congress did is they repealed the Judiciary Act of 1801, which meant that those midnight judges that were appointed by President Adams could not assume office. Okay? That was his plan. Could not assume office. We'll see how that works for him. Okay? One thing Congress did do, this really isn't a change, but we'll put it under changes, is even though President Jefferson thought that the Bank of the United States was unconstitutional, Congress actually kept it. Okay? So Congress kept the National Bank of the United States, even though President Jefferson thought it was unconstitutional. One of those things that he thought he better keep. So Congress did not repeal the National Bank of the United States. It kept it, even though Jefferson felt it was unconstitutional. Was that a Federalist idea when it came out? Absolutely. Okay? Now, do you remember back when they made the deal, the Assumption Bill, where the South agreed to pay off the North's state debts in exchange for the capital to be moved? Okay? Well, one of the things Congress did right away when Jefferson took office is Jefferson ordered Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin to use federal government money to start paying off those state debts that they agreed upon. Okay? So another thing Congress did is they allowed President Jefferson to order Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin to start using federal government money to pay off those state debts, which was the agreement on the Assumption Bill that moved the capital south. So again, the fourth thing Congress did is they allowed President Jefferson to order Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin to use federal money to pay off those states that had debt. From what? The Revolutionary War. Okay? Now, here's another thing Congress did under Jefferson that I thought was a little strange, but they did it anyway. The last thing is they actually reduced both the Army and Navy in size by cutting funding. So Congress reduced in size both the Army and the Navy by cutting funding. So they repealed the excess tax on whiskey. They repealed the Judiciary Act of 1801. They kept the National Bank of the United States. President Jefferson ordered Secretary of Treasury Gallatin to pay off state debts with federal monies, and the Congress cut funding to both the Army and the Navy, which reduced them in size. Okay, those are the congressional changes. That'll take us to our next subtopic, which is John Marshall and the Supreme Court. And we're going to talk about a very important Supreme Court decision entitled Marbury versus Madison, which I'll probably be on your AP exam next year, I'll bet. So John Marshall and the Supreme Court. Now you think about this. Republicans win a sweeping victory in the election of 1800. Congress controls both houses of, Republicans control both houses of Congress. The only control that the Federalist Party have in our government is Chief Justice John Marshall. He is a Federalist. So he's the only control that the Federalists have, and they control a lot of the federal court system. Now, as you could probably figure out by things that were done, these Federalist judges that were appointed by Adams during the midnight appointments, which included John Marshall, really irritated and annoyed Jefferson. He thought that was horrible, did not think it was right, and so he was going to kind of make it his life mission to try to get those midnight judges so they could not take oath of office, which we already talked about, right? He got Congress to repeal that act, the Judiciary Act of 1801, in hopes that those midnight judges, including Marshall, could not take office. Okay? Now, kind of an interesting story is the one that's going to cause him the most problems and irritation is going to be John Marshall, who was actually Jefferson's cousin. He was Jefferson's cousin. Did you know that? John Marshall was Jefferson's cousin. And he's going to be the Federalist judge of all those midnight appointments that's going to cause President Jefferson the most grief. And they're related. One's a Federalist, though, and one's a Republican. So Marshall's going to be a thorn in Jefferson's side. Now, the first ever major Supreme Court case that was decided by John Marshall would put him in direct conflict with his cousin, President Jefferson. And let me tell you how this happened, because you're going to have an essay on just exactly this particular subtopic we're talking about. So make sure you understand. Well, we already said that when Jefferson took office, he wanted to block the Federalist judges that were appointed by Adams, right? We're all clear on that. So what he did is President Jefferson ordered his Secretary of State, James Madison, not to deliver the commissions to those Federalist judges that were appointed by Adams. I'll repeat that so you can get that down again. President Jefferson ordered his Secretary of State, James Madison, not to deliver the commissions to those Federalist judges that were appointed by Adams. Okay? Jefferson orders his Secretary of State, James Madison, not to deliver the commissions to those Federalist judges appointed by Adams. Anybody know what a commission is that James Madison is not going to deliver? The definition of a commission? Call to work, she said. That's pretty close. It's an order granting power. If you don't have that order granting power by the president, known as a commission, then you cannot be a Federalist judge. You have to be given that commission or that order granting you the power to be a Federalist judge. Well, what Jefferson did is he ordered Secretary of State Madison not to deliver those commissions or order that granted power to those judges, because if they don't get the commission, they can't judge. Does that make sense? Okay, and he ordered him to do that. Well, one of those Federalist judges was a guy by the name of William Marbury. William Marbury was one of these Federalist judges that Madison would not deliver his commission to. Okay, so what do you think William Marbury did when he couldn't get his commission? He sued. Hey, sued and took him to court. And where to go to? All the way to what? Supreme Court. So John Marshall's going to rule on whether President Jefferson has the ability to not give those commissions to those federal judges that were appointed by Adams, which included who? himself. Okay, so this will be interesting. So, this Supreme Court case in which William Marbury sued for his commission went down in history as the Supreme Court decision of Marbury versus Madison. So who's Marbury really suing? James Madison, who is actually the one that didn't give the commission. He was ordered by Jefferson. So this is Marbury, not versus Jefferson, Marbury versus Madison. So who is Marbury suing? Madison. Because he's the one that brought the decision to him that he was not going to give him his commission. Is everybody following this? Because you are going to have an essay on this. Okay? And this happened, this went to the Supreme Court in 1803. In 1803. So the case of Marbury versus Madison goes to the Supreme Court in 1803. So how do you think Justice Marshall rules? What would you think? Does Marbury have the right to his commission or not? He says he does, according to the Judiciary Act of 1789. Remember, that's the one that developed the entire court system, right? And so what Justice Marshall rules is that Marbury should or does have the right to his commission as a result of the Judiciary Act of 1789. However, Marshall further ruled that the Judiciary Act of 1789 had given the Supreme Court more power than the Constitution allowed. So he first of all rules that Marbury does have the right to his commission as a result of the Judiciary Act of 1789. But then he further ruled that the Judiciary Act of 1789 gave the Supreme Court more power than the United States Constitution allowed. Therefore, the Judiciary Act of 1789 is, or what's the word? Unconstitutional. Okay, I'll repeat that again. So Justice Marshall rules that Marbury did have a right to his commission according to the Judiciary Act of 1789. However, Marshall further ruled that the Judiciary Act of 1789 had given the Supreme Court more power than the Constitution allowed, thus making the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional. What's resulted in Marbury receiving his commission or no? No. So in the end, Marbury does not get his commission, and neither will any of the other judges.
What about him?
Jefferson allowed him to stay, which was a smart move. Now, think about this. By ruling an act of Congress unconstitutional, and the act of Congress was the Judiciary Act of 1789, by ruling that unconstitutional, Marshall had established a doctrine called judicial review. So, by being the first to rule an act of Congress unconstitutional, and that act of Congress was the Judiciary Act of 1789, Marshall now established a new doctrine called judicial review. Now, what does that mean, do you think? Think about it. In the past, what's happened? The President or the Congress has come up with an idea like the whiskey tax. President comes up with the idea, Congress passes it. Who's to make sure they're on the straight and narrow prior to this ruling by Marshall? Nobody. What judicial review is it would give the Supreme Court the right to decide whether an act of Congress or the President would be allowed by the Constitution. Prior to Marbury versus Madison, that was not the case. If the President or Congress passed a rule or a law, nobody had the right really to question that. There was no judicial review to see if it was unconstitutional. Just like Jefferson thought the Bank of the United States was unconstitutional. That's what he thought. What the Supreme Court would now have the power to do is to decide whether it was constitutional or unconstitutional, because that bank was passed by Congress. Okay? So that's the thing you have to really understand about Marbury versus Madison, is what it does in the end is it allows the Supreme Court to decide whether any act by Congress or the President of the United States is in violation of the United States Constitution. Prior to that, that was not the case. Do you kind of understand that? So, the Supreme Court could now overrule the actions of the other two branches of the federal government, Congress and the presidency. Okay? Wasn't like that before. So this whole thing started by this appointment situation that Jefferson was trying to pull commissions, right? The whole thing came from that. And it turned out to be a very important Supreme Court decision in our nation's history, and it gave the Supreme Court the power it needed to govern this country better. That's what Marbury versus Madison is all about. And if you get a test question like that on your AP exam, they're going to ask you to explain the significance of Marbury versus Madison in comparison to today's government. And you'll just write what I just told you. You'll write an essay. That's kind of how it works. That's why you're going to write an essay on this on your test, which I'll explain exactly how I want later. But do you understand the whole thing, the whole process? Okay, we're going to pull commissions. We get sued. It's ruled the Supreme Court that they shouldn't be able to pull commissions. On the other hand, the Judiciary Act that allowed commissions to be given was unconstitutional, so they could pull commissions. It overturned a congressional decision, which meant it went under judicial review, and from this point on, basically, the Supreme Court has the power to say, you know what, that congressional law is unconstitutional. Prior to that, nobody had that ability. Okay? Very important that you understand. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which kind of ties into this, which is judicial impeachments under Thomas Jefferson. Judicial impeachments. Now, we probably should explain to you the impeachment process first. Anybody know of anybody that's been impeached? Anybody? Nixon did not get impeached. He resigned prior, but that's a good one. That's going to use that example. Who's the only president in our country got impeached? Bill Clinton. No, that's not the only president. Bill Clinton was impeached, and so is Andrew Johnson. Okay, now let me tell you a story about impeachment before we get into this. If you're impeached, does that mean you're thrown out of office? How many people think that means you're thrown out of office? What does it mean then? It means you're accused of a high crime or misdemeanor. And then you plead your case to what branch of Congress who decides whether you are going to be thrown out of office or not? No, Senate. So if you are impeached, that means you are accused of high crimes and misdemeanors against the federal government, and then once you're impeached by the House, you are then tried and either acquitted or sentenced by the Senate. Does that make sense? So if Olivia was accused of a high crime or misdemeanor in this class, the House of Representatives would impeach her. She would go to trial in which the Senate would decide whether she was guilty or not guilty. Okay? We've had 2 impeachments. I'll tell you a little bit about them. I mean, 2 big presidential impeachments. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, right? Andrew Johnson, a Southerner, took over the presidency. All the Northerners hated him, so they made up all these lies about him, and they impeached, the House impeached him, because they were more consistent of Northerners. The House impeached him for high crimes and misdemeanors, and he went on trial. When he went on trial, he pled his case, or his attorneys pled his case, and then the Senate votes. And you have to have 2/3 majority. If 2/3 of the Senate say guilty, you're kicked out of office. So Andrew Johnson doesn't have a prayer. All the Senate and House members are Republican. Some are radical Republicans. He's a Southerner. They hated his guts. So they go on their roll call vote in the Senate, guilty, not guilty, and it comes all the way down to the last vote. And whatever Senator Edmund G. Ross of Kansas votes is what happens. And what is he? He's a Republican. And so all the Republican senators are joyous because they know Edmund G. Ross wouldn't risk his political career. He would never vote not guilty. They're going to impeach Andrew Johnson. And everybody goes through the process, and it comes down to poor Edmund G. Ross, senator of Kansas, and he votes not guilty. And his political career over. Just like that. But he voted his conscience. The significance of that, in 1955 and 56, John Kennedy wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book called Profiles in Courage. Won the Pulitzer Prize, very famous book. I got several copies over there. So popular they made it. There was an original first printing, there was an inaugural edition, there was a memorial edition. You can still get them today, 50th anniversary edition. And what John Kennedy did is he wrote about 8 courageous Americans. 8 Americans that did something very courageous, that stood to their values. Edmund G. Ross was one of the 8 he wrote about for that vote. Okay? Bill Clinton gets impeached. He goes through trial to the Senate, and they acquit him, and he is not thrown out of office over the Monica Lewinsky situation. Back to Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was involved in the Watergate scandal. Republican friends of his and congressmen that were very close to him talked him into resigning before he was impeached and went to trial. So he was facing impeachment by the House and probable conviction by the Senate, so he chose to resign before that happened. Those are some cases. So now that you know what impeachment is, President Jefferson wasn't going to stand still for these, still wanted these midnight judges out of there. Still wanted them out of there, okay? And so he just didn't want any more Federalist measures, he didn't want any more Federalist appointments. So what he did is a couple of things. First of all, you remember the Alien and Sedition Acts that we talked about? Did we talk about those? Okay, well he basically suspended the Alien and Sedition